Way to you. This is a re-recording of the original webinar presented by Worshipful Brother Reuben Ayres in October. Due to technical issues, we were unable to record it the first time, and he's kindly agreed to re-record it for us. Very kind of him. So thank you very much, Worshipful Brother Reuben. It's very much appreciated. So without further ado, I will pass over to you.
Gareth, thank you very much indeed. Firstly, thank you to Gareth for asking me to give this presentation and for setting up the whole webinar series, and indeed for fronting the learning and development program for Devonshire Province of Freemasons. Thank you to anyone who happens to come across this video and finds it of some interest. So the title is The 7 Liberal Arts and Sciences. This is part 1, the Trivium. It is expected that you will make such of the liberal arts and sciences your future study as may lie within the compass of your attainment. Now, these words come towards the end of the ceremony of initiation. You've all heard them. But what have you thought about them? Are they just a piece of old Masonic ritual to be learned by rote, or is there some deeper meaning or value within them? Well, over the next 30 minutes or so, I hope to convince you that the 7 liberal arts and sciences are indeed a valuable discipline of learning and education, developed by the ancient Greeks, but equally of value today, embraced by cutting-edge science, and indeed of great value to all of us. Now, this picture here by Giovanni di Ser Giovanni Guida is a picture of the 7 liberal arts and sciences. You can see them labeled there at the top: arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, labeled astrology here, but astronomy, logic, rhetoric, and grammar. Those are the 7 liberal arts and sciences. And the 7 characters that you can see at the bottom of this picture are those characters thought by the artist to be exemplars of those particular disciplines. And here they are. But there are various interpretations as to who some of these characters may be. But you can see for arithmetic, we have Pythagoras. Geometry, we have Euclid. Age-old associations there. But for music, we have a very interesting Masonic character, i.e. Tubal-Cain. Then the others follow, as you can see on the slide. The 7 liberal arts and sciences have their origin in ancient Greece. They passed through the period of the Romans and were incorporated into the medieval universities. Their aim is to cultivate reason, eloquence, and wisdom. The 7 liberal arts and sciences are divided into 2 groups: the Trivium and the Quadrivium. Why are they called the 7 liberal arts and sciences? It comes from the Latin liber, meaning to free, and the idea is that the study of these intellectual disciplines frees the mind and allows it to focus on intellectual rather than the vocational skills. And these particular intellectual skills were considered important for education in citizenship, for the pursuit of inquiry in general, and of virtue. So I've said that the 7 liberal arts and sciences are divided into 2 groups, and indeed they are. The Trivium, generally considered the language arts, are those of grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And then the Quadrivium, more the mathematical sciences, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And the 7 liberal arts were considered important disciplines of study in universities across Europe, and indeed there are still courses in the liberal arts and sciences taught in some English universities to this day. The Trivium was generally taught as a course in itself, preceding the Quadrivium, and you might consider that a form of brain training, as it were, before you take on some of the more mathematical ideas in the Quadrivium, which would follow. Okay, so the Trivium: grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Grammar, the mastery of language and correct expression. Rhetoric, for the Greeks, was a very different concept from the one that we are used to today. It didn't have the same connotations of dishonesty and deviousness that it's associated with today, and was thought more to be to do with the mastery of persuasion and of eloquent communication. Logic, the mastery of reasoning and correct thinking. Okay, so we'll go through these one by one. Grammar is the study of the rules governing language structure and language usage. And the first formalized grammars really developed in Iron Age India in the 6th century BC. It was expanded by the Greeks and probably more so, or at least equally so, by the Romans, then again passed down through the medieval universities. And until relatively recent times, I'd say a generation or so ago, maybe 2 generations, was a standard part of teaching in English schools. Sadly, typically no longer. It forms the basis for communication and interpretation, and to allow those things to occur with precision and with the minimum of misunderstanding. So here are some examples of what can happen when grammar goes wrong. It's not a popular subject these days, and some people feel that it's somewhat irrelevant in the modern age, but here are some rather humorous examples of what happens when people overlook the rules of grammar. The song Lola by the Kinks, written by Ray Davies. Here's a line from it. I'm glad I'm a man, and so is Lola. And those of you who know the song know that that isn't Lola being glad that the singer is a man. It's that Lola is a man, and the singer is basically chatting this girl up in a bar, not realizing that Lola is indeed a man. Here's an old joke by Groucho Marx. This morning I shot an elephant in my pajamas. How he got in my pajamas, I don't know. Boom, boom. Okay, those are humorous examples, but here's an example of where a simple grammatical error made a very important and expensive difference to a particular company in the USA. So this goes back to 2017, the Oakhurst Dairy in Maine. And at that time, a Maine statute exempted certain workers from overtime pay if they performed the canning, processing, preserving, freezing, drying, marketing, storing, packaging for shipment or distribution of 1, agricultural produce, 2, meat and fish products, and 3, perishable foods. Now, the court held that there was an ambiguity in this sentence, in particular surrounding the phrase packaging for shipment or distribution, which you may be able to see my pointer pointing around now. It's on the 3rd line. So certain workers were exempt from overtime if they were involved in those things, blah, 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 packaging for shipment or distribution. And the ambiguity centered around whether that phrase fragment there meant that the exemption was for workers doing packaging for shipment or distribution, or whether it meant that it was an exemption for workers packaging for shipment or involved in distribution in the wider sense. So does it mean the exemption is for packaging for shipment or packaging for distribution? Or does it mean that the exemption is for workers involved with packaging for shipment or distribution in any sense? And the court held that the absence of a comma in that sentence created an ambiguity, and that the exemption therefore did not apply to workers working for distribution in a broader sense, meaning that they were owed overtime by the company. So that tiny little grammatical error, the absence of a comma, proved very expensive for the Oakhurst Dairy. Moving on to rhetoric. As Aristotle and the ancient Greeks would have seen it, this is the art of persuasion and eloquent speech. It involves composition, style, and delivery, and was considered essential for public life, law, and politics. Rhetoric is divided into three elements called the ethos, the logos, and the pathos. In essence, the ethos is the credibility of the speaker in the eyes of the audience, his or her reputation, whether they're held to have authority, and whether they are trusted. So these things may well precede the arrival of the speaker or the lecturer or the politician or whoever it is on the stage. These things may precede the presentation. The logos is argumentative proof or reasoned demonstration. And the pathos is persuasion by putting the audience into a certain emotional state. So what are the elements that constitute the ethos, the credibility of the speaker? Or do they appear to have practical wisdom or competence? Do they appear knowledgeable? Do they have a reputation for being knowledgeable, for having good judgment, for understanding their topic and the context within which they're speaking? Are they perceived to have moral virtue, or at least shared values with the audience? Are they believed to be a good person, morally upright? And are they believed to have goodwill, to have the audience's best interests at heart, rather than just pure self-interest? Next, within the elements of rhetoric is the logos, which is basically the argument itself. Are the arguments founded on reasonable premises? Is the argument intelligible, reasonable, and structured towards audience conviction? Do the arguments follow one from the other? And then the pathos, persuasion by putting the audience into a certain emotional state. So we need to think what the emotion might be, to whom that emotion might be directed, and the circumstances under which that emotion might arise. So here are some examples of the sorts of emotional state that a speaker might want to engender in his audience in order to try to persuade them towards at least a certain interpretation of what he or she may be saying. So anger, for example, the desire for revenge due to a perceived slight. Well, you might provoke that by suggesting contempt or insult from the person from whom you have been slighted. You might try to dissipate anger by engendering respect or reflecting an apology or calmness. And there are other emotional states here, which I won't go through one by one, but each of those might be used in order to try to move an audience in a certain direction and to embrace a certain interpretation of what's being said or what is being presented. I'll give some examples in a moment. Okay, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Okay, so what is the emotion he's trying to engender here? It's one of hope, tenderness, and moral yearning. What is the technique he uses? He uses familial imagery, i.e. his children, and that in itself universalizes the struggle and invokes empathy, or evokes empathy, even from opponents to the argument. Why pathos? Well, Aristotle says pathos moves the soul by placing the audience in a certain frame of mind. And Martin Luther King here creates hope and compassion that softens resistance to the logical argument that he is using here in his quest for justice. There would be many ways of trying to articulate that argument, but many would not have the same effect and emotional impact as this particular choice of phrasing. Moving into the 1990s, Carl Sagan, Pale Blue Dot. The picture you can see on the right there is a picture of the Earth as seen from Voyager 1 as it was leaving the solar system. It's a tiny, tiny white dot just by that pointer there in that sunbeam. Look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. Every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. So what is the emotion appealed to here? It's one of awe, one of humility and tenderness for humanity. And the technique is partly the use of repetition. That's here, that's us, and of scale and contrast, the enormity of the cosmos versus our tiny little lives on that little white dot. And he's invoking emotional wonder that opens the listener to his rational plea for compassion and stewardship. Moving ahead even more recently to 2015, the Charleston church shooting. Here's Barack Obama's response to it. Blinded by hatred, the alleged killer could not see the grace surrounding Reverend Pinckney and that Bible study group. The light of love that shone as they opened the church doors and invited a stranger to join them in prayer. And the emotion obviously is one of sorrow and admiration. The technique is using contrast between good and evil, between evil and grace, and the use of a slow lyrical rhythm. And it elevates grief into reverence, transforming a collective sadness into a moral unity. It's a textbook use of pathos. And we might say, how might even the presentation of this slide make a difference to how an audience might perceive that particular statement there from Barack Obama? Well, say I put up exactly the same slide for you to read, but with that picture of Barack Obama. creates a slightly different emotional vibe, as it were. Or this one, more evoking a sense of anger. Or this, completely inappropriate, too casual, too relaxed, totally inappropriate in juxtaposition to the event about which he's talking. Okay, so the rhetoric, in Aristotle's view, divided into the ethos, the logos, and the pathos. I've put them in a different order here. The logos, the logic can be sound, but people may not follow it. The pathos, the manipulation, if you want, of emotion can move people, adjust their frame of mind and the way they might respond to the argument, to the logos. But it can be fleeting, and it can be, frankly, manipulative. But Aristotle argued that the ethos, the character of the presenter, the speaker, that's the essential thing that builds trust. And once trust exists, both emotional and logical appeals gain greater weight. So he saw that as being the most important of the three elements of rhetoric. And here are some examples of why that is almost certainly true. So in modern terms, you can see this in action everywhere. People often vote for who they trust, not necessarily who makes the best argument or presents the most rational case. Advertising often sells credibility and authenticity as much as the product itself. And even in the courtroom, where you would have thought the argument itself, the evidence, should reign supreme, a jury's impression of a lawyer or a witness's honesty can outweigh mountains of evidence. Obviously, the balance between the importance of those three elements, the logos, the ethos, and the pathos, will vary depending on the context. In science, we hope at least that the logos dominates. In the arts, pathos often leads. And in leadership, politics, or teaching, the ethos reigns supreme because it sustains persuasion over time. Okay, so we come on to the logic. The science of correct reasoning. It teaches argument, analysis, and inference. It's the foundation for philosophy and for critical thinking. It's the intellectual core of the Trivium and ensures that thought and speech are governed by truth rather than fallacy. So the discipline of logic, again, is derived largely from Aristotle, the structure of reasoning, of categories and predictables and how those things are classified, of propositions, how statements are formed and related, of syllogisms, how conclusions follow from premises, and fallacies, how reasoning can go wrong, and certain dialectic topics, sources of argument for and against a particular position. Okay, so the syllogism is one form of logic that Aristotle was very keen on. And it's based on the idea of the major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion. The major premise is the all-embracing statement. The minor premise is an example within the sphere of the premise, and the conclusion is is what you end up having to believe if you accept both the major premise and the minor premise. So here's an example. Major premise: all men are mortal. Minor premise, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, therefore, Socrates is mortal. So if you accept the major premise and you accept the minor premise, you have to accept the conclusion. There is no other intellectually sustainable destination. Here's another example. Major premise, all contracts signed under duress are invalid. Minor premise, this contract was signed under duress. Conclusion, therefore this contract is invalid. Again, if you accept the major premise and the minor premise, it is irrational not to accept the conclusion. It naturally follows. But syllogisms can go wrong. Here's an example. Major premise, you are either with us or against us. Minor premise, you are not with us. Conclusion, therefore you are against us. And this is the sort of argument that is frequently used in politics, or arguments or discussions between any groups that differ in opinion on a particular subject, be it politics, religion, or whatever. And it's clearly fallacious. It is not the inevitable conclusion of the major premise and the minor premise that you are against us. You may not have a view. You may have a complex view that is partly with us and partly against us. The fact that you are not with us does not automatically lead you to the inevitable conclusion that you're against us. So the fallacy here is that either you are with us or against us is not a binary statement. It isn't either or. There are subtleties that exist outside of those extremes. Another example below, major premise, all cats are mammals. Minor premise, some mammals are dogs. Conclusion, therefore some dogs are cats. Well, clearly fallacious, but why is it fallacious? Well, it's because the category of mammals contains animals other than cats, humans, chimpanzees, and such like. Now, logical fallacies are legion, and we come across them all the time. They can be categorized in various ways, and Aristotle was a great lover of categorization. He was originally a biologist, and therefore that naturally led his thinking into categorization. And here are some here. I just want to point out two on this slide. So there's the fallacy of combination, of assuming that if one thing is sweet and another thing is sweet, that if you combine them, the net result must be sweet. So attributing a note, a musical note that is sweet, and another musical note that is sweet, if you put them together into a chord, the chord must be sweet. Well, it may well not be. It may be a dissonant chord and it may be harsh and not sweet at all. Despite its individual elements being sweet, they don't necessarily combine into a sweetness. Or there's the fallacy of confusing different grammatical forms or definitions of words. So the one at the bottom here, bottom right, the state has a head and arms, therefore it can walk. Well, clearly nonsense, and the head and arms is not meant in any robotic sense or in an animal sense. They're figurative terms. Here are some more fallacies, and again, I'll just mention two. Firstly, the one on the bottom. This occurs in general conversation more frequently than you might imagine. If it rains, the streets are wet. The streets are wet, therefore it rained. Well, not necessarily. Obviously, the streets may be wet for all sorts of reasons. Go up to the one here called non causa pro causa, otherwise known as post hoc ergo propter hoc. The rooster crowed, then the sun rose. Therefore, the rooster caused the sun to rise. Well, not at all. Just because one thing follows another does not necessarily mean that the first event caused the second event. It might just be coincidental, or it might be that both events were caused by a third event, as it were, that preceded both of them. Now, that latter fallacy is something that is encountered in medicine all the time, otherwise known as post hoc ergo propter hoc, because something happens afterwards doesn't necessarily mean it was caused by what happened before. And here are some examples. Bloodletting was thought by the ancients all the way through to the 19th century to be a reasonable method of treatment of all sorts of medical ailments, in particular various types of fever. And it was found that after bloodletting, on certain occasions, the patient would indeed improve and sometimes recover. But taken in the round, there was no reason to believe that any of those recoveries or improvements were due to the bloodletting. It was happening purely by chance. And indeed, more patients suffered because of bloodletting than were improved by it. Similarly, with mercury treatments, in particular for syphilis, very little evidence at all to suggest benefit. Similarly, with the pain medicines, the snake oil and such like, through the 19th and early 20th centuries, even to this day, with homeopathy, believed by many to be a valuable form of treatment, there is no scientific reason to suspect that it might be of any particular value, given the fact that these compounds are diluted beyond Avogadro's number. There is not a single molecule of the substance in the solution that is being consumed. And no scientific evidence in terms of double-blind controlled studies that homeopathy improves any particular medical condition. But it's also a fallacy we fall into in allopathic medicine as well. When we look at the evidence for the value of tonsillectomy for recurrent sore throats, in particular in children, which was a very common form of treatment up until the 1960s, 1970s, it's found that the balance of evidence is not in favor of tonsillectomy, i.e., overall, it doesn't work. And it's an operation that is not without significant risk, in particular bleeding. Here's another example of the fallacious use of argument by Joe McCarthy in the 1950s in the United States during the period of McCarthyism, when large numbers of American communists were accused of conspiring against the government. So some communists work in government. Therefore, many government employees are communists. It's an actual statement from Joe McCarthy. If we don't purge all dissidents, that's supposed to be, or all dissent, sorry, America will fall to communism. Well, a slippery slope. Associating anyone with left-wing groups is disloyal. Sorry, associating anyone with left-wing groups is disloyal. So guilt by association, they're not necessarily disloyal at all. And this had serious consequences in the 1950s in the USA. Many lives and careers were destroyed. some quite deliberately. Some people even took their lives over the constant persecution that they received from the state. And the Senate eventually censured McCarthy when his reasoning collapsed under scrutiny, but not before an enormous amount of harm was done. So, in conclusion, the Trivium is the first part of the 7 liberal arts and sciences, and it comprises grammar, how to speak correctly, logic, how to think correctly, and rhetoric, how to express thought effectively. Next time, we'll come on to the quadrivium, which follows the trivium and comprises arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy.